Okay, welcome back everyone. What we're going to cover right now is one of two relatively similar yet somewhat distinct messages or forms of messages that are commonly used or can be definitely used in business communication. The first we're going to talk about in this video is the negative or bad news message. Some of the goals when it comes to providing bad news. Now, bad news can be everything from responding with a no or a can't do or whatnot. So it's usually contrary to what the receiver expects to hear. First of all, the usage. Well, negative messages or bad news messages are found in all forms of business communication. Now, these would include email, memorandum, letters, reports, and also oral presentations and conversations. However, for this class, we are going to again focus only on the written communication. Now, your dilemma will be to determine which of the methods, written methods, you will use when providing the bad news to the receiver. Now, will that be in an email form? Will that be in a memorandum form? Or will that be in a letter form? Now, we have covered all three of these. We have talked about when do you use these, when don't you use these. So from the context of the situations that you will receive in the future, well, for the assignments, the next two assignments for sure, you will have to determine, well, will this be an email, will this be a memo, or will this be a letter? Now, again, if you are not sure when do you use which of these, you need to go back and take a look at the corresponding videos, readings, and viewings for these three particular areas. So let's go ahead and proceed now. Goals of bad news. Well, there's primary and secondary. So let's talk about the primary goals. First of all, the primary goal is to make the receiver understand and accept the bad news. Now, few, if any, people like receiving bad news. Everybody likes to hear positive responses. Well, unfortunately, that's life. You don't always get the good. You're going to get some bad. So again, you have to make the receiver understand and accept the bad news. Additionally, for the corporate point of view, you must maintain a positive image of you, the initiator of the message, as well as the organization you represent. So, in essence, while the individual receiving the bad news may not like it, they are going to accept it and hopefully at the same time keep a positive image of your organization. It is going to be rare instances where you are going to provide bad news to a customer and you don't care if they come back. Okay, in business we already know that the heart of business is repeat business. So if you basically alienate a customer, they won't come back. And just because you have to provide bad news does not mean you have to alienate them. So that's what we're going to focus on from the writing point of view. Some secondary goals we've got here. Well, first is to reduce bad feelings. There really is no reason. Nobody, like I said, nobody likes to receive bad news, but there's no reason to have bad feelings as a result of it. You have to convey in the message that the response is fair. Okay, that it's going to be the same for everyone, no matter who provided the initial inquiry. The same message, the same negative bad news message will be sent to everyone. Also, you have to indicate that or you don't want to have further future correspondence. Unlike what we talked about in routine messages, in the closing you've always put in some kind of a call for an action. Is it implied or explicit? call me if you don't like this, let me know, so on, so on. You want to keep the communication open. However, in bad news, you don't. You want the bad news to be delivered. You want it to be accepted, not necessarily liked, but accepted, and to move on from that point in time. So again, another thing is creating legal liability or responsibility for you and your organization. Again, this is not so much of an issue, but you got to be careful what you say, when you say it, and how you say it. Let's take a look at some legal issues here. First of all, abusive language. Well, there's defamation, which is the language that harms a person's reputation. You got to be extremely careful with this. So you got to be careful, not necessarily when you write to the person to whom you are communicating, but if the result of the bad news is because of someone else, you have to be aware that you really need to be very cautious about presenting that. Liable, I believe you already know, is the written defamation. This is where we are going to focus. Now, in other courses, slander is the spoken defamation. Again, we're not going to worry about that, but definitely liable we're going to have thought or be thinking about as we prepare our messages. Some careless language. We also need to be careful about what we say. Sometimes it could be very, we may not really understand what we're saying. We think there's nothing wrong with it, but we do sometimes make statements that are potentially down the road at a different level could be misinterpreted and a problem. For example, take a look at this. The factory is too hazardous for tour groups. Now, by its statement, most individuals would understand, well, geez, factories can be a dangerous place, and, well, sometimes you can't have tours. You can't have open tours. A lot of companies do that. A lot of manufacturing companies, assembly plants allow tours, usually within a safety zone of double yellow lines, but generally speaking, a lot of companies don't do this. Now, the problem when you put in this statement, it's not so much for the tour groups, but if you think about the individuals that you employ and work in these hazardous groups, if you put in the statement the factory is too hazardous for tour groups and one of your employees becomes injured and they are aware that this is in writing, this statement is in writing, it could be used as a basis for a lawsuit. So again, be very careful about what you say. Look at the consequences beyond the immediacy. The good guy syndrome. Now, I'm sure none of you like being the heavy. I certainly don't. Most people do not. Some do, but most don't. So we need to be careful about what we say. Dangerous statements that ease your conscience or make you look good. An example, I thought you were an excellent candidate, but we had to hire, and you can finish the sentence. We had to hire someone else. We had to hire this individual, whatever the case might be. The point is, when you write for the company using company letterhead, you are the agent or of the organization. You are speaking for the organization, and you must only express the views of the organization. Therefore, do not include anything about your personal opinions. That's a big no-no. If you do want to express your own personal opinions, which I frankly would suggest you don't, but if you do, use plain paper for personal views. Avoid supplying information that could be misused. Don't admit or imply responsibility. Check with your legal counsel. Okay, you look at some of the major issues out there, particularly with the auto industry. Let's look at General Motors, for example, with the ignition switch key. Not once has General Motors ever admitted shall we say, responsibility for the deaths. Now, they've always indicated they've admitted responsibility for a problem with the equipment. There has been really no direct connection per se where they were apologizing for the deaths, admitting responsibility for the deaths. It won't happen. That would open to tremendous legal obligations. Not that they don't have enough as it is now, but even far more. So again, be careful what you say. Now let's talk about the pattern. With routine messages, we've always had a direct pattern. You start with an opening, states the purpose, the body states the details, the closing states maybe a summary and a call for an action. We're not going to use that with bad news. The opening, a neutral or a positive opening that does not reveal the bad news. Now, in this case, fluff is acceptable, but don't overdo the fluff, okay? Keep it to a minimum. I'll give you an example in a little bit. Next, the body is going to really have two parts. The first part is the reason for the bad news, an explanation of the causes or the reasons for the bad news without mentioning the bad news. Okay? Again, we will talk about this further. The second body part is the bad news and alternatives. Now, a clear but understated announcement of the bad news. Don't come out and say, we can't do this. There'll be other ways of doing it. Again, we'll talk about this. But also, it is wise to, if you must say no, give them an alternative. Again, we'll talk more. Finally, the closing. A final thought is appropriate. Goodwill is appropriate, but again, do not have a call for an action. You do not want the person, when they realize it is bad news, to call you and say they don't like this. You want them to accept it and move on from that point. Onward. Opening, provide some kind of a buffer. Now, buffers can be very positive. They're generally very positive. Remember, you're setting the stage for someone to hear something they probably don't want to hear. So if you have a customer who's been around for a long time, a good thing would be, to start off with, ABC Company appreciates loyal customers such as yourself. Without individuals such as yourself, the company would not be what it is today. Something like that. Again, fluff, but it is positive fluff. Make sure it's accurate, but it is positive fluff. Keep it to a minimum. Avoid raising any false hopes, particularly if it's related to what you have to tell them no to. So again, keep it really relatively general, not directly related to the situation, but kind of, calm them down and get them in a neutral frame of mind. If you must start with an apology, and again, I recommend that you don't do this. Again, do not admit the fault. Okay. The first body section. Okay, again, you're presenting the reasons here. Now, explain clearly why the request must be denied without revealing the proposal or the refusal. Excuse me, not the proposal, refusal. Now, the best way to do this, and the most often used reason, is company policy. So what you would say is, it is company policy to do something. You won't say it is company policy not to do something, because the second not is negative. You try to use as few, if any, negative terms as possible, because the reader is going to be aware of the message and picking up on those, which is going to develop a negative response to your message. Choose positive words. Avoid the negative again. Cannot, claim, denied, error, failure, unwitting. Look at the opposite of that and tell them what you can do, what can be done, what will be done, instead of what you won't do, can't do, will not be done. Show that the matter, again, was treated seriously and fairly. You can say, a review board looked at this and the decision would have been applied to everyone. Something like that. Okay, move on. The second part is cushioning and the bad news. Now, you do eventually have to give them bad news, but you don't necessarily have to come out and say this is bad news. So consider positioning the bad news statement strategically by what we call sandwiching in between other sentences. Or, better yet, consider implying the refusal, but be sure it is clear. It is suggested that a compromise or an alternative be available. Companies can always come through with some form of alternative. Between you and me, it's we can't do this, but we will do this. Now, you're not going to say that, but that's the idea. The bad message, the bad news, followed immediately by what will be done. Now, don't make these two sentences. Remember punctuation. A period tells the reader to digest the thought of the sentence. So if you give them the negative message followed by a period and then an alternative sentence, you're going to lose the guts of that alternative. The emphasis won't be there. I would suggest that you start with the negative message, the bad news, whatever that might be, comma, then immediately follow with an alternative. Example: while we typically move in this direction, we will, in your case, go in that direction. All right. The comma tells the reader to pause for a moment because something else is immediately coming. You don't have that downtime, and it's kind of a no, but here's an alternative. So think about writing that way. Okay. Accentuate the positive by describing what you can do, not what you can't do. Again, this is the full technique. Try to be as unnegative as possible. Yes, you can do it. It takes time. It is not easy to do, but you can do it. The closing, again, maybe a summary. I would probably be careful about summaries because then you're reapproaching it. Maybe looking forward. Again, we appreciate you being a loyal customer. We look forward to working with you in the future. Offer some good wishes, maybe the compliments. Avoid referring to the refusal. Again, you've mentioned it. You're done. Let's move on. Again, no call for action. No, if you don't like this, if you want to talk about this, give me a call, whatever. We're done. None of that. This final screen here shows you the routine message, which we have been doing so far in emails, letters, and memorandum. The opening, the body, the closing, the routine message opening, the negative message opening, followed by the body, the closing, and it will show you the differences between those two. Now, in the next video that you're going to see, we're going to be talking about persuasive or marketing messages. In other words, what you're doing in those is making people do or convincing people to do things they don't want to do. Persuasion. So, take a couple minutes here. I think we're done with negative messages. Take a couple minutes and then take a look at the persuasive marketing message video. Thanks. Talk to you soon.